In the shallow rice fields of Thailand, the water sometimes drops so much that only a small puddle remains. In that water, a single fish is left. It doesn't complain. It declares that place its own world. This is where the Betta fish comes from, and that's why loneliness, for it, is not a lack, but a habit, a strategy. It is not a fish that became alone, but one born to live alone. Today, we're going to talk about why this small warrior chooses solitude and the psychology behind it. We'll understand how the Betta fish became so perfectly adapted to living alone. We'll talk about a warrior shaped by Thailand's rice fields, about millions of years of survival engineering written into its body, and about how colors are actually a language. And at the end of the video, I'll explain why the Betta fish chooses solitude not as a necessity, but as a conscious preference. Now, let's begin a journey that will help you understand the true nature of this small warrior's relationship with loneliness. The Betta fish's homeland is the rice fields, swamps, and slow-moving canals of southeastern Thailand, the shallow, still waters of the Mekong and Chao Phraya basins. During dry seasons, these waters shrink so much that sometimes only a small puddle remains. Most fish cannot survive these conditions, except the Betta fish. It is this environment that gave it its noble character: scarce resources, endless competition, and a territory that must be won every single day again. Being alone here was not a disadvantage. It was the safest way to survive. In Thailand in the 1800s, children began catching these fish in rice fields and making them fight. As they fought, spectators would bet on them. This is where its other name comes from: the Siamese fighting fish. The Thai royal family took a close interest in these fights, and in the 19th century, both wild-caught and domesticated fish were used in these events. Eventually, selective breeding began. Today's Betta fish, with its long silk-like fins and deep blue and red colors, barely resembles the dull gray-green appearance of its wild ancestor. Shaped for centuries by human hands, this species is born from the meeting of two histories: a wild swamp warrior and human aesthetic obsession. The most unusual feature of the Betta fish is that it does not use the same way of breathing as other fish. A structure called the Labyrinth organ is located in the upper part of its head, just above the gills. This highly folded, vessel-rich organ allows the Betta to extract oxygen directly from the air. You can think of it like a lung. Both the gills and this organ work at the same time. That's why it can survive even in oxygen-poor swamp waters. That's why you sometimes see it going up to the surface for a quick breath. This is not a sign of illness, but an evolutionary advantage gained over millions of years. Its scales tell another story. Beneath the skin are two types of color-producing cells: pigment cells and iridophores. Iridophores create a metallic shine by refracting light through crystal-like structures. The blue and turquoise tones you see are not pigment, but a physical optical phenomenon. Like soap bubbles or peacock feathers, it changes depending on the angle, plays with light, transforms within the moment, and when the gill covers fully open, the dark membrane, known as the beard, becomes visible. What fascinates us while watching is actually its strongest visual weapon. It is the moment it appears larger, more dangerous, more determined. In nature, the Betta fish is a solitary predator. This solitude may seem like a necessity, but it is actually the result of a system that must constantly be maintained. A male Betta does not simply chase another male that enters its territory. First, it warns. It flares its gill covers, fully expands its fins to appear larger than it is, and positions itself sideways to display maximum profile. This language is a finely tuned threat ritual developed over thousands of years. Sometimes no fight happens at all. The other fish reads this performance, calculates, and withdraws. The mating behavior is a bit more complex. The male builds a bubble nest at the surface. Made of air bubbles coated with saliva, this structure is like a cradle rich in oxygen and protected from external threats where eggs can attach. It courts the female and brings her underneath. In a position described as an embrace, the eggs are fertilized, and the male immediately collects them in his mouth and places them into the bubble nest. He guards them until the fry hatch. In betta fish, child care belongs to the male. That bubble nest is an unexpected side of a warrior fish. Betta fish owners often say it has a personality. People hearing this usually smile and move on. But research shows there is a serious truth behind these anecdotes. The betta fish is one of the most commonly used model species in aggression research. The reason is this: visual stimuli alone are enough to trigger a full aggressive response. In other words, there is no need for another fish. Just an image, even its own reflection in a mirror, is enough. Each betta fish has its own distinct character. Some are much less aggressive, others much more persistent. In mirror tests, fish observed over weeks showed a decrease in response intensity over time. This is a form of adaptation, meaning learning. Scientists also report strong observations that bettas can distinguish their owner from strangers. Time spent together, feeding routines, and consistent behavioral patterns, all of these are recorded. In the wild, betta fish live among dense vegetation, under roots, in the shade of leaves, in shelters close to the water surface. This preference is not random. It is the architecture of instinct. A betta swims less in bare aquariums. In other words, as rocks and plants are added, as corners are formed, swimming behavior increases. This is not just space. It is psychological safety itself. If there is no place to hide, it cannot define its territory. If it cannot define its territory, it falls under chronic stress, and this stress reflects in its colors. It becomes pale, dull. Because for it, solitude only makes sense when it is in a space it can control. There is also this: if a betta is building a bubble nest, it is one of the clearest signs that it feels safe. The bubble nest is a reproductive behavior, but also a measure of security. If you see that small cluster of bubbles, it means your fish is saying, "I feel safe here." So what is the sign that shows the betta fish truly lives solitude as a choice? The betta fish is an indoor warrior. It evaluates every movement, processes every new presence as a potential threat or rival. Because of this, when it encounters another fish, its reaction is not just aggression, but a behavior to protect its territory and order, and it has no tolerance for the possibility of its order being disrupted by another fish. Its structured movements and spatial control, its distant and determined stance toward the outside world, are signs that the betta fish is a strong individual who needs no one. It is the quietest but most meaningful decision of a warrior. The next time you see the color of its gills change, or a bubble nest appear on the surface, you'll already know what these mean. Because inside that small aquarium, there is not just a beautiful fish. There is a character that sets its own rules, governs its own space, and consciously maintains its solitude. How does your betta fish experience this solitude? Does it strongly defend its territory, show structured behavior, or still seem chaotic and stressed? Write in the comments. I'll read each one. If you're curious about the next fish I'll talk about, like this video and subscribe. Let's dive deeper into the aquarium together.